Sometime in the 17th century before the Common Era, a workforce burned their tools, marched through the night to the gate of the most powerful authority in the known cosmos, and declared collectively, unanimously, without identifying a single ringleader, that they had decided to stop. The oldest detailed account of that event in any surviving written record fits on a fired clay tablet roughly 25 centimetres along its longest surviving edge. It sits in the British Museum's Middle East collection under the kind of low conservation lighting that makes fired clay look almost warm, 234. It measures roughly 25 centimetres along its longest surviving edge, and the lower right quarter is missing, broken off at some point in the last 3,500 years, taking several lines of text with it into whatever soil eventually covered the city of Sippar. The surface is damaged in places, chipped near the upper margin, the clay darkened by the original firing, but in the second column, where the narrative begins to accelerate, the cuneiform impressions are still clearly legible under magnification, pressed at slightly varying depths, the stylus moving faster in some lines, slower in others, as if the scribe had been working through a passage he knew well enough to write quickly, but that still required something of him. His name is in the colophon of the third tablet in the set, Ipikaya, junior scribe, writing during the reign of a Babylonian king named Amasuduka. The month was Ayar. The year is reckoned somewhere between 1646 and 1626 BCE under the Low chronology, or approximately 2 decades earlier under the Middle chronology. The precise dating of the Old Babylonian period remains one of the more actively contested problems in Mesopotamian scholarship. Wherever you are listening to this, whether tonight finds you in London or Lagos, in Mumbai or Melbourne, in Toronto or Johannesburg, in a city whose name would have meant nothing to Ipikaya and everything to whoever commissioned his work, take a moment with that image. A junior scribe, sometime in the 17th century before the Common Era, pressing wedge-shaped marks into a clay tablet to record a story. The story he was recording was already old when he wrote it down. And what it describes, in its very first column, before the flood, before the survival of any single human being, before Atrahasis himself appears in the narrative, is a revolt. Before we go further, where are you watching this from tonight? Drop your city in the comments and tell me what time it is where you are. The paragraph you just heard is addressed to you specifically, wherever you happen to be, and I mean that. The geography of this thing is part of the point. Not a metaphor for a revolt, not a distant echo of conflict filtered through theological language. A revolt, in the oldest available sense of the word, a collective refusal to continue, tools put to fire, a march through the night to the gate of the most powerful authority in the cosmos, and a declaration that every single member of the striking body has individually and jointly declared war. The tablet describes this event with a specificity that stops you, or it would stop you if you had ever read it. And that is the problem the tablet shares with most of what it contains. The Atrahasis epic, these 3 tablets, their associated fragments distributed across the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum and several other collections, became the subject of a complete scholarly edition only in 1969, when W.G. Lambert and A.R. Millard assembled the composite text from fragments that had been arriving in European institutional collections since the 1870s. The flood story in Tablet 3 attracted immediate comparison with the biblical narrative of Noah. The revolt in Tablet 1 drew considerably less attention, which is, when you sit with the passage itself, genuinely difficult to understand, because what Tablet 1 describes is not merely a myth about discontented divine labourers. It is the oldest detailed account of systemic labour grievance and collective political confrontation in any surviving written record. The gods hold a vote. They make a unanimous declaration. They burn their equipment, surround their overlord's residence in the middle watch of the night, and refuse to identify a ringleader because, as the text puts it, with a directness that does not require interpretation, every single one of them made the decision together. Enlil, the supreme authority in the Sumerian divine hierarchy, the god who held dominion over the earth and whose temple at Nippur was the religious centre of the Sumerian world, hears the noise from inside his house and does not immediately know what it means. His face goes pale. The text compares his complexion to a tamarisk. His vizier Nusku has to get him out of bed. The question of why that detail is in there, why the most powerful divine figure in the ancient Near Eastern cosmos is described at the moment of maximum crisis as pallid with fear and needing to be woken up, is not merely a literary curiosity. It is the question that runs through everything that follows in the revolt sequence. And the answer the text provides over the next several hundred lines, before the flood begins and before Atrahasis builds his boat, is one of the most quietly unsettling things in the entire Mesopotamian textual record. Before you can follow where the revolt leads, though, you need to understand what the gods were doing before they stopped. Samuel Noah Kramer, writing in 1963 in his study The Sumerians, Their History, Culture and Character, was drawn to a particular feature of Mesopotamian creation theology that distinguished it sharply from the dominant traditions of the ancient Mediterranean world. In most cosmological narratives from Greece and Egypt, the world is shaped for human use. Humans arrive into a world that has been prepared for them, ordered according to divine intention, waiting. In Mesopotamia, the sequence is reversed. Humans arrive to relieve the gods of labour they can no longer bear. Thorkild Jacobson, whose The Treasures of Darkness, published by Yale University Press in 1976, remains one of the most penetrating analyses of Mesopotamian religious thought, framed this differently. For Jacobson, the Sumerian conception of the divine was inseparable from the concept of work. The great gods, Anu, who governed the sky, Enlil, who held the earth, Enki, who commanded the freshwater depths, these were not idle sovereigns. They were the primordial forces of nature conceived as labouring beings, and the world was understood as the product and ongoing condition of that labour. The Tigris and Euphrates did not simply exist, they had been dug. The first lines of Atrahasis' tablet once state this without preamble. When the gods, instead of man, did the work, bore the loads, the gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. And then, several lines later, the specification. The gods had to dig out canals, had to clear channels, the lifelines of the land. The Igigi had to dig out canals, had to clear channels, the lifelines of the land. The gods dug out the Tigris riverbed, and then dug out the Euphrates. These are not the great gods. Anu, Enlil, and Enki divided the cosmos among themselves and took their governance roles at the opening of the narrative by lot. The Tigris was dug by the Igigi, a term whose meaning has been the subject of considerable scholarly discussion. In its broadest use across Mesopotamian literature, Igigi refers to the lower order divine workers, the gods of the second rank, assigned to the labour that the senior gods no longer perform themselves. The great gods, the Anunnaki in their senior function, made the Igigi carry the workload sevenfold, according to the text. The number is not precise arithmetic. It is the Akkadian idiom for an excessive and crushing multiplication of burden. Here the scholarly disagreement that Kramer and Jacobson both noted from different angles becomes relevant. Kramer tended to read the divine labour mythology of Atrahasis as a sophisticated projection of actual Mesopotamian labour conditions into cosmological narrative, a theological account of why humans work, grounded in the observable reality of a civilization that depended entirely on organised hydraulic labour. The canal systems of the Tigris-Euphrates basin were not natural features of the landscape. They were the accumulated result of thousands of years of human excavation, maintained by systems of corvée obligation, the Ilku, the obligatory labour service, the 3 administrative tablets from roughly 2100 BCE document in extraordinary logistical detail. These tablets, held in the Yale Babylonian Collection and in the British Museum, record labour drafts organised by temple and palace administration. So many workers assigned to such a canal section, so many days of digging, the names of overseers, the quantities of spoil removed. The connection Kramer drew was inferential but not idle. The society that produced the Atrahasis epic was the same society that organised its agricultural survival through mandatory labour on irrigation infrastructure. What the myth describes as the work of the Igigi before humans existed was, in the lived experience of every Babylonian who heard the story recited, the work of their neighbours, their parents, themselves. Jacobson pushed the interpretation further. For him, the labour of the Igigi was not merely a reflection of human social conditions, it was the theological explanation for why the Sumerian cosmos required management at all, why the world was not simply static but constantly needed work to remain habitable. The Dulu, the labour or service incumbent on the lower divine beings, was the force that kept rivers flowing, channels clear, the land productive. It was, in Jacobson's reading, a cosmological concept as much as a social one. The universe required ongoing maintenance, and the question of who performed that maintenance was among the most fundamental questions a Mesopotamian thinker could pose. 40 years before any human existed to share the burden. The text repeats the phrase twice in slightly different formulations with the regularity of a scribal emphasis. For 3,600 years they bore the excess, hard work, night and day. The figure 3,600 is the Sumerian numeral Shah, a positional unit in the sexagesimal counting system, 60 squared, whose use in literary contexts carried the connotation of a cosmic cycle or great year, an entire age, rather than a precise duration. It is intended to communicate something about the depth and completeness of the labour period, an entire age of divine toil before the crisis point. And then the groaning begins. They groaned and blamed each other, grumbled over the masses of excavated soil. The image is precise enough to carry weight across 3.5 millennia. A workforce at the edge of its endurance, exhausted past the point where individual effort maintains dignity, beginning to turn against itself. The blame that circulates among the Igigi before the revolt is not aimed upward, not yet. It moves laterally, the way frustration always moves before it finds its direction. What focuses it is a voice. The text names him Allah in one passage, the Igigi who organises the inchoate grievance into action. His speech to his divine colleagues is brief and direct. Come. Let us carry Enlil, the counsellor of gods, the warrior, from his dwelling. Now cry battle. Let us mix fight with battle. The Atrahasis text at this point was not describing something its ancient audience found implausible. The Corvée labour tablets from the Ur III period, those precise administrative records of workers and days and canal sections, include documentation of labour disruptions, though they are recorded in the dry language of administrative failure rather than narrative. Sections of canal left unfinished, quotas unmet. The system depended on compliance that was not always forthcoming. The myth was not inventing a situation, it was giving it a cosmic frame. But there is a detail in the revolt sequence that none of the administrative tablets anticipate. Before the march to Enlil's gate, before the night confrontation, the Igigi do something that the text registers in a single, clean, formally significant line. They set fire to their tools. Not, they put down their tools. Not, they refuse to pick them up. They burned them. Why burn the tools rather than simply abandon them? The question is still there in the passage, waiting. The word Anunnaki appears across the Sumerian and Akkadian textual record with a consistency that initially seems reassuring and a fluidity that on closer examination is one of the more honest signals that the ancient Near Eastern theological tradition was not a systematized dogma but a living discourse that varied by period, city and scribal school. In the opening lines of Atrahasis, the term operates in at least two different registers within the same text. The Anunnaki are the great gods, the senior divine beings who assign the labour and hold the cosmic governance roles. Anu holds the sky, Enlil holds the earth, Enki holds the Apsu, the freshwater depths below. These are the Anunnaki in their sovereign function. The Igigi are assigned labour by the Anunnaki and bear it. The distinction appears structural and stable, except that later in the same text, at the moment of creation, the same narrative uses Anunnaki and Igigi almost interchangeably as collective nouns for the divine assembly. And in other Mesopotamian texts, the Anunnaki appear as underworld gods, or as terrestrial ones, or as the judges of the dead, depending on the context and the city of composition. Jacobson concluded that the distinction was real but contextually flexible, that Anunnaki and Igigi referred to genuinely different orders of divine being in certain texts and were used as literary variants in others. What this means for the revolt is that the social structure it reflects was probably not a fixed constitutional order, but a dynamic, contested arrangement, one in which relative positions were understood as the product of negotiation, historical circumstance and force. Any attempt to construct a clean hierarchical organisational chart of the Mesopotamian divine order would be a modern scholar's imposition on material that was never intended as systematic theology. The Atrahasis narrative describes a revolt by a defined group of divine workers against a defined group of divine authorities. The terms are used with precision within that narrative, but the narrative does not exist in isolation from a broader textual world in which those terms shift. What this means for interpreting the revolt is that the social structure it reflects was probably a dynamic, contested arrangement, one in which the relative positions of different divine powers were understood as the product of negotiation, historical circumstance, and force. Enlil's position at the head of that arrangement is, in the Atrahasis context, unambiguous. He is the counsellor of the gods, the warrior, the formulation the text repeats in incantatory fashion each time it introduces him. His home is the Ekor, the temple complex at Nippur that served as the theological centre of Sumerian civilization for more than 2,000 years. The Weld Blundell Prism, a four-sided baked clay column held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford under the registration WB 444, is one of the principal surviving versions of the Sumerian King List, the administrative theological document that recorded the line of pre- and post-Diluvian kings organised by city. Nippur is not on the list as a seat of kingship. Nippur never held the name Lugal, the kingship, in the Sumerian political theology. Nippur was something else, a religious centre whose authority over political legitimacy depended not on military power but on Enlil's endorsement of whatever king held temporal power at any given moment. To rule Sumer, you needed Enlil's blessing. To receive that blessing, you needed Nippur's recognition. This is what makes the Igigi revolt not merely a labour dispute, but a constitutional crisis. Enlil's legitimacy rested on his position at the apex of a cosmic order in which every being, divine and human, knew its place and performed its function. The revolt was not simply a workforce refusing to dig, it was a challenge to the intelligibility of that entire order. If the Igigi could collectively refuse, and if no individual ringleader could be identified and punished, then the entire scaffolding of divine governance, the system of lots, the assignment of functions, the hierarchy of counsel and command, had no enforcement mechanism that could contain it. Enlil's fear is not a character flaw, it is the text's way of registering the structural severity of what has happened. But here there is an ambiguity in the divine assembly that the revolt produces. Enlil summons Anu and Enki, the sky god and the freshwater god, the other two members of the primordial triad. They come, they listen, and Enki, whose response to the crisis will determine its resolution, arrives on the scene with a quality the text has been quietly establishing since his introduction. He is described as far-sighted, as the god whose counsel runs ahead of the immediate problem, who sees the shape of what is coming before the others do. Throughout Atrahasis, Enki's sympathies lie conspicuously closer to those under pressure than to those who apply it. He is the god who will later warn Atrahasis about the flood, defying the divine oath. He is the god who, time and again in the Mesopotamian textual tradition, finds a way around the decree that threatens annihilation. But at the moment of the revolt, when Enlil asks the assembly what to do about the mob surrounding his gate, Enki's counsel takes the form not of solidarity with the Igigi, but of a different kind of solution entirely. one that resolves the immediate crisis while leaving the question of the Igigi's satisfaction permanently open. In the middle watch of the night, the second of the 3 divisions of a Babylonian night, the fire goes up. The text describes the moment with the compression of something witnessed rather than composed. They set fire to their tools, put aside their spades for fire, their loads for the fire god, they flared up. The verb used for the fire of the tools and the flaring up of the god's approach to Enlil's gate is the same root. The burning is not incidental. It is the first act of the revolt, performed before a single god has moved toward the Ekor. The question planted in the opening, why burn the tools rather than simply refuse to use them, now has a context in which it can be examined. And the answer is neither simple nor, in the end, fully satisfying, which is probably appropriate. Before the assembly agrees to a solution, it is worth sitting with the specific shape of what they are agreeing to, because the resolution of the revolt does not lift the burden. It moves it. Stephanie Daly, whose translation in Myths from Mesopotamia, first published by Oxford University Press in 1989 and subsequently the standard scholarly English rendering, notes the parallel between the tool burning and the established literary convention of the symbolic destruction of the instruments of submission. Across the ancient Near Eastern world, the breaking or burning of a tool, a tablet of obligation, a seal, was a recognized act of juridical significance. It meant this contract is dissolved, this relationship no longer holds. The thing that bound us to this work no longer exists. The Igigi did not put their tools down, they destroyed them. The distinction matters because it changes the nature of the act from a temporary work stoppage, a strike in the modern industrial sense, with the implicit possibility of resumption, into something closer to a declaration that the terms of the original arrangement were void. There would be no going back to the old work. The tools that bound the Igigi to the digging of the Tigris and Euphrates beds were gone. W. G. Gay Lambert, in his foundational 1969 edition of the text prepared jointly with A. Ra. Millard drew attention to the legal implications of this scene without pressing them further than the evidence allowed. Lambert was a careful scholar. His annotations in Atracases, the Babylonian story of the flood, are models of the restraint that the fragmentary state of the text requires, and he noted that the tool burning represented a formal termination of the labour contract rather than a suspension of it, without claiming that the Babylonian scribes who transmitted the text necessarily understood it in those terms. What the text does make clear is what happens next. The mob of gods reaches the Ekor. It is the middle watch. Enlil does not know they are there. His gatekeeper Kalkul locks the gate and rouses Nusku, his vizier. Nusku wakes Enlil, and Enlil, the supreme authority of the cosmos, upon hearing from his vizier that his house is surrounded by a divine multitude, immediately calls for weapons and orders Nusku to stand in front of him. The staging of this scene is worth slowing down for, because the Atrahasis text, which Daly's translation renders with a clean, almost documentary plainness, is deploying something that reads as deliberate dramatic irony. Enlil calls for weapons. He takes a defensive posture inside his own house, behind his locked gate, while the armed divine rabble surrounds him. This is not the cosmological sovereign in command of his domain. This is a figure under siege, calling for protection against his own subordinates. The text gives Enlil's reaction a physical register that is unusual in the Mesopotamian record. Your face is sallow as a tamarisk, Nusku tells him. The comparison is from the plant world, a tamarisk in the dry season, stripped and pale. It is not a complimentary image, and it is spoken by a vizier to the most powerful god in existence, in the middle of a crisis, as a statement of observable fact rather than reproach. Enlil looks terrified. The text records this without embarrassment. When Nusku is sent out to demand who led the revolt, he finds the assembly of Igigi waiting in the darkness and puts the question directly: who is in charge of the rabble? Who declared war? Who ran to the door of Enlil? The answer that comes back is the detail that has stayed with every reader of the passage since Lambert and Millard made it accessible in 1969. Every single one of us gods declared war. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive. It is killing us. Our work is too hard, the trouble too much. So every single one of us gods has agreed to complain to Enlil. There is no ringleader. The text does not provide one because the revolt does not have one. Allah's name appears in the passage that precedes the march, but the response to Nusku's question, voiced by the assembly as a whole, in the first person plural, specifically distributes the agency across every participant, every single one of us. The formulation is repeated twice, once as declaration and once as restatement after Nusku brings the message back to Enlil. The political significance of this distribution is not accidental. Enlil's response to the revolt, once he calls the great gods into assembly, is to ask, who is responsible, who can be cast for destruction as a signal that the revolt is broken. The standard ancient Near Eastern mechanism for ending a rebellion was to identify its leader, make an example of them, and demonstrate to the remaining participants that individual resistance had consequences. The Igigi's unanimous declaration preempts that mechanism entirely. There is no leader to punish. The revolt belongs, equally and indivisibly, to all of them. Enlil, who has spent the sequence inside his locked house, listening to Nusku carry messages back and forth, now hears the message and weeps. The text is specific. Enlil listened to that speech. His tears flowed. A Babylonian audience in the 17th century BCE would have recognized the weight of that image. A god who weeps because he cannot identify a single target to hold responsible for the crisis he faces is not merely an emotionally accessible figure. He is a political authority whose governing tools have just been rendered useless. What happens next determines the rest of the narrative. Anu, the sky god, gives the decisive counsel. Rather than attempting to punish any individual god, they should accept that the work was genuinely too much. And Enki, far-sighted, already running the calculation forward, proposes a solution. Let the womb goddess create offspring, and let man bear the load of the gods. The assembly agrees. The revolt ends not with punishment, not with negotiation, not with any reduction in the total load of work that the system requires. It ends with the invention of humans specifically to absorb that load. And the specific language Enki uses to formulate this resolution, let man bear the load of the gods, is worth sitting with because it is both a practical solution to the immediate crisis and a permanent answer to the Igigi's complaint that contains something of a displacement. The load is not reduced, the burden is transferred. Whether the Igigi understood, in the moment of the resolution, what had happened to their grievance is a gap the tablets do not fill. But the structure of the resolution leaves it visible. The revolt is resolved not by addressing the grievance, but by finding someone else to carry it. Thorkild Jacobson's reading of Enlil, developed across several decades of scholarship and finding its fullest expression in the Treasures of Darkness, positioned the god as the cosmic embodiment of authority, the principle by which force becomes legitimate command, by which the natural violence of wind and storm and flood becomes ordered governance rather than mere destruction. Enlil's name in Sumerian is conventionally passed as En, Lord, plus Lil, wind, air, the atmospheric force between sky and earth, the animating breath of the world's authority structure. What this means for the revolt sequence is that Enlil's terror inside the locked echo is not a characterization of an individual god's weakness, it is the text's way of representing what happens to authority itself when the obedience on which it depends is withdrawn. Enlil does not fear physical harm, the Igigi cannot destroy him. What he fears, and what Nusku's observation about his pale face confirms, is that the thing he embodies may have been revealed as contingent. The order that depends on the Igigi's compliance is only as real as that compliance. When Anu and Enki arrive at Enlil's summons and the assembly of the great Anunnaki convenes, the scene that follows has the structure of a legal proceeding. Enlil presents his case. He is surrounded. He asks whether he should do battle. He demands to know what he has witnessed. Anu makes his reply. Enki makes his proposal. The text gives us the deliberative sequence with a formality. Enlil made his voice heard and spoke. Anu made his voice heard and spoke. That echoes the administrative language of the Earth 3 legal and royal archive. This is not a domestic quarrel among supernatural beings. It is a governance crisis handled through established procedural forms. The proposal that resolves the crisis requires something no previous text in the surviving Mesopotamian record had proposed with this explicitness: the killing of a god. On the 1st, 7th, and 15th of the month, I shall make a purification by washing. Then one god should be slaughtered. Enki's proposal is careful in its ritual framing. The days named are the Babylonian days of purity, the days on which cleansing rites were performed, which means the killing is not an execution in the conventional sense, but something closer to a sacrifice, a transformation of one kind of divine substance into another. The god selected is named, in the old Babylonian version of the text, Ilawela, a name that has posed difficulties for philologists. Lambert and Millard noted that the name does not appear elsewhere in the Mesopotamian record with enough frequency to establish its full semantic range. In some manuscripts, the god is called Geshtui, a name that means something in the range of ear or understanding, the faculty by which one receives and processes information. The choice of this particular attribute as the substance from which humans are made has attracted considerable scholarly attention because it suggests that the characteristic quality of the killed god, the quality of perception, of being aware, becomes the specific divine inheritance that humans carry. The text describes the creation with a material precision that holds the theological abstraction at a productive distance. Nintu, also called Mami, the womb goddess, the midwife of the gods, mixes clay with the slaughtered god's flesh and blood. She pinches off 14 pieces, 7 on the right, 7 on the left. Between them, she places a mud brick. 7 males are shaped, 7 females. The mud brick between the two groups is the object that appears in Mesopotamian birthrites, the piece of compressed earth on which a woman in labour rests her feet, the grounding object at the threshold between one state of being and another. What Mummy says when the creation is complete is the climax of the revolt sequence, and it is worth reading in full. I have relieved you of your hard work. I have imposed your load on man. You have bestowed noise on mankind. I have undone the fetter and granted freedom. The Igigi hear this speech. They are freed, the text says so directly. They kiss the feet of the womb goddess. The relief of the divine workforce is accomplished, but the load is not gone. The channels still require clearing. The rivers still need maintenance. The work that the Igigi performed for 3,600 years does not disappear because humans have been created to do it. The fetter is undone from the Igigi and placed around the necks of humanity instead. Mummy's declaration of freedom is accurate from the perspective of the divine workers who have been relieved. From the perspective of the humans who have just been created, it is the founding document of an obligation they never had the chance to refuse. Whether the ancient Babylonian scribes who transmitted this text heard in it something like the irony a modern reader might hear, the colophon does not say, but the structure of the narrative makes the tension visible. Humans are created to solve a problem that the gods themselves could not solve. The revolt that should have raised the question of whether the work needed to be done at all is resolved by finding someone else to do it. The question of whether that resolution was understood as a solution or a deferral is one that the next layer of the Atrahasis narrative, tablets 2 and 3, answers with considerable specificity, though not in the direction Enlil hoped. The phrase that Nusku uses when he observes Enlil's pallor, rendered by Dali as sallow as a tamarisk, has a deceptively simple surface. In the original Akkadian, the comparison draws on Binu, the tamarisk tree, a plant native to the river valleys of Mesopotamia that in its dry season state presents a stripped, grey-white appearance. The comparison was not unusual in Akkadian literary language. The tamarisk carried specific associations with aridity, exposure, and a kind of skeletal austerity that the poetic tradition had established as a register of paleness or bloodlessness. What makes the line unusual is its speaker and its context. Viziers do not typically tell divine sovereigns that their face looks like a dry tree branch. The line sits in the passage with a directness that several philologists have flagged as either deliberate characterization or a remnant of an older, less formally deferential version of the text. Lambert, in his 1969 notes on the passage, observed that the formula occurs in a small number of other Akkadian texts in contexts of acute fear or shock, which suggests it functioned as an established idiom for what we might call fear blanching, the physiological pallor of acute stress, rather than as an insult. It was, in other words, a clinical observation dressed in botanical clothes. But the fact that the text includes it at all and applies it to Enlil in this specific moment is significant. The Mesopotamian royal and divine literary tradition was not generally inclined toward unflattering physical description of its highest authorities. Hymns to Enlil describe him in terms of majesty, radiance, and the controlled ferocity of the storm. The comparison to a dry tamarisk is of a different register entirely, and it appears at the moment when Enlil is, in the terms of the narrative, most fully himself, the embodiment of cosmic authority confronting the limits of what authority can do. The scribe who wrote these lines down, Ipikaya, signed himself in the colophon of Tablet 3 as Enhupsharosiharu, a junior scribe, a scribe of lower rank, writing during the reign of Amisaduqa. The designation junior scribe has been read by several researchers as indicating that the copy was a training exercise, a senior text assigned for reproduction as part of a scribal curriculum rather than commissioned for a specific archival or ritual purpose. This is not a trivial detail. The scribal schools of ancient Mesopotamia, the Eduba, literally tablet house, used literary texts as the primary material through which advanced scribes learned Akkadian grammar, formula, and literary convention. A text that appeared in the curriculum of a Babylonian scribal school in the 17th century BCE was not merely being preserved, it was being actively reproduced, copied, and presumably studied. The Atrahasis text was not an obscure archival curiosity in its own time. It was a teaching document, a canonical text in the Babylonian scribal tradition, copied by students learning the craft. The question this raises, why a text that was clearly canonical in old Babylonian scribal culture eventually became so obscure that its revolt sequence could sit in a British Museum collection for nearly 90 years before receiving a complete scholarly treatment, is partly answered by the history of the tablets themselves, and partly by something about how the Western reception of Mesopotamian literature organised its priorities. Lambert and Millard's 1969 edition made the composite Atrahasis text available to the scholarly community for the first time as a coherent whole. Before that publication, fragments from the Sipper collection at the British Museum had been identified and partially described, but the reconstruction of the three-tablet sequence required the kind of painstaking cross-referencing of fragments from different collections, British Museum, University of Pennsylvania, Istanbul, Yale, that depended on exactly the kind of sustained, undramatic philological labour the text itself was, in some sense, commemorating. The irony is not forced. The story of a workforce that struggled under an excessive load for a very long time before anyone addressed the problem is preserved in fragments that required a very long time and considerable labour to reassemble into something legible. What the scribal context also reveals is something about the nature of the text's authority in its own time. The colophon that Ipikaya appended to Tablet 3 is the closing formula of a professional scribe completing an assignment. The name of the composition in its first line title, When the Gods Instead of Man, the line count 390 for the third tablet and 1245 for all three tablets together, the scribe's name, rank, and the date. This is the administrative signature of a text that was being managed as part of an institutional record. Somewhere in the administrative apparatus of old Babylonian scribal culture, someone was tracking how many lines the Atrahasis epic contained and ensuring that copies were complete. In Mesopotamian epistemology, the ear was not merely a sensory organ, it was the seat of wisdom in a specific and quite precise philosophical sense, the organ through which counsel is received, through which the word of a god or a superior enters a person and becomes actionable knowledge. To have an open ear, uznarapashtu, literally a wide ear, was the standard Akkadian idiom for wisdom, for the capacity to receive and understand divine communication. Atrahasis himself is characterized by this quality. His name means extra wise or exceedingly wise, and the first time the text introduces him, midway through Tablet 1, after the creation of humans, it describes him as the man whose ear was open to his god Enki, the man who could hear what the gods communicated, whose faculty of divine reception was exceptional. This is not coincidental. The god who was killed to provide the substance from which humans are made was the god of exactly the quality that makes Atrahasis special. The divine wisdom that was destroyed to create humanity persists in its most concentrated form in the human being who will survive the flood. The theological resonance of this construction is considerable, and it cuts in two directions. On one reading, it represents the Babylonian tradition's insistence that humans carry genuine divine substance, that the capacity for wisdom and divine reception that defines the best of humanity is not a human invention, but an inheritance from the divine world, passed through the body of a sacrificed god. On another reading, it represents something closer to a tragic irony. The faculty that was killed to create humans is the very faculty that allows humans to understand what was done to them. Several scholars working in the Mesopotamian theological tradition have noted this tension. Daly's commentary in Myths from Mesopotamia touches on it without resolving it. Lambert's notes in the 1969 edition observe that the choice of Geshtu'e rather than a god of strength, or a god of agricultural fertility, or any of the other divine qualities that might seem more practically relevant for a workforce, implies something deliberate about the Babylonian understanding of what makes humans distinctively human. It is not their strength that comes from the divine world. It is their capacity to understand. Mami's creation procedure, as the text describes it, has both a ritual and a practical register. She mixes clay with the god's flesh and blood. She pinches off 14 pieces, 7 on the right, 7 on the left, with a mud brick placed between them. The womb goddesses, 7 on each side, assist the process. The mud brick at the centre of the scene is the same object that appears in Babylonian birth ritual, the libitu, the brick of labour, the grounding object of the delivery room. What this means is that the creation of humanity is presented in the Atrahasis text simultaneously as a cosmological event and as a replication of ordinary human birth. The same procedures, the same objects, the same numerical structures that govern human reproduction govern the first creation. The gods are making humans the way humans make humans, which collapses the distance between the mythological moment and every subsequent birth, and implies that every human being born into the Babylonian world participates in the original creation rather than merely descending from it. The Igigi's involvement in the creation is given a specificity that the text does not explain, but records with notable precision. After Mummy has mixed the clay, and before the pieces are pinched off, the text states, the Igigi, the great gods, spat spittle upon the clay. This is not a casual detail. Saliva in Mesopotamian ritual had specific purifying and animating properties. It appears in healing texts, in binding formulas, in the procedures for activating sacred objects. The spittle of the Igigi enters the clay that will become the first humans, alongside the blood of the killed god. The divine workers who demanded relief from their labour become in this moment participants in the creation of their replacements. They do not stand apart from the solution that ends their revolt. They contribute to it. Whether this is presented as a willing contribution, as part of the Igigi's consent to the resolution, or as simply the procedural requirement of the creation rite, the cuneiform is silent here. But the image of the divine labourers adding their own substance to the clay that will bear their burden is one that the text does not soften. It is there, it is specific, and it sits in the passage with the same kind of quiet precision as the Tamarisk comparison, doing more work than its few words seem to contain. After Mummy completes the creation and the first humans exist, the gods celebrate. The Igigi kiss her feet. They give her a new name, Mistress of all gods. The celebration is genuine, or at least the text presents it as genuine. The divine workforce has been relieved. The labour continues. The divine faculty of reception that was killed to create humans is the same faculty that allows humans to direct their prayers upward with a force that the gods, who designed that faculty and then distributed it into the world, had not calculated for. Whether that capacity was anticipated or whether it becomes the source of the next problem is exactly what Tablet 2 discloses. The 40 years before the Igigi Revolt produced groaning and mutual blame in the text's description. The parallel in Tablet 2, after humans have been created and set to work, is a noise of a different kind. The country was as noisy as a bellowing bull. The god grew restless at their racket. Enlil had to listen to their noise. The sequence repeats, in slightly varied formulation, as a refrain across Tablets 2 and 3. It is the structural hinge of the entire narrative. The labour crisis that produced the revolt has been resolved, but the resolution has generated a new problem of the same type, an uncontrolled, unmanageable output from the workforce that disturbs the rest of the divine authority who depends on their labour. The Akkadian word translated as noise in Dali's version is rigmu, a term that encompasses not just sound, but the full social presence of a large population, their prayers, their complaints, their demands, their sheer accumulation of need. Rigmu directed upward toward the gods was, in the Mesopotamian ritual framework, how prayer worked. The smoke of offerings, the pouring of libations, the recitation of hymns, all of these were forms of human sound reaching divine ears. The problem Enlil describes is not that humans are failing to perform their religious obligations, it is that they are performing them too well, too loudly, too constantly, with the full force of the divine intelligence they carry in their substance. The humans created to give the gods rest are now preventing Enlil from sleeping. The text renders the escalation of Enlil's response in stages across the two tablets, each stage more severe than the last. First, disease. The god Namtar is directed to release Surapu, a wasting illness, to reduce the human population and quiet the noise. But Enki intervenes, advising Atrahasis to redirect the population's religious energy toward Namtar himself, overwhelming the disease god with offerings until he is shamed into withdrawing his hand. The disease lifts, the noise resumes. The second attempt is famine. Enlil orders Adad, the weather god, to withhold rain, the sky god Anu to lock the air above, the springs below to run dry. The description of the famine in Tablets 2 and 3 of the Atrahasis narrative is among the most sustained and precise accounts of starvation in any ancient text. Dali's translation preserves the incremental quality of the passage's structure. In the first year, they ate old grain. In the second year, they depleted the storehouse. By the third year, human faces are covered with scabs. By the fifth year, a daughter watches the sale of her mother. By the sixth year, children are served as food. The progression is not sensationalized, it is documented. Each year is given a specific observable marker of the starvation's advance, moving from the administrative, the depletion of stored grain, through the physical, the changed appearance of faces, the stooped posture of the starving, into the domestic, and finally the unspeakable. The Babylonian scribes who wrote and copied this passage were not inventing a hypothetical disaster. The Tigris-Euphrates basin was subject to periodic crop failure and drought throughout its history, and administrative records from the Ur-3 period and later document the specific progressions that the Atrahasis text is describing. Enki foils the famine as he foiled the disease, by directing Atrahasis to channel human religious attention toward Adad, the rain god, in a way that produces shame. The gods, in the Babylonian theological framework, were dependent on human offerings for their sustenance in a reciprocal relationship that could be weaponized. A god-denied offerings experienced something the texts describe in terms close to hunger. Adad, overwhelmed by offerings he was expected to receive, while simultaneously withholding rain from the people making them, withdraws his hand. The famine ends. Enlil's fury when he discovers that Enki has again undone the plan is recorded with a directness that removes any remaining ambiguity about the state of the divine governance apparatus. The Anunnaki, Enlil tells the assembly, had all agreed together on a plan. The plan has been violated from within by the one God whose counsel was supposed to make it work. Read through the lens of political philosophy, the revolt is a meditation on what happens to authority when the obedience it depends on is withdrawn, not by an individual who can be punished, but collectively, indivisibly, by every member of the workforce at once. This reading captures the structural sophistication of the narrative, the unanimous declaration that preempts punishment, Enlil's fear, the solution that transfers rather than reduces the burden, the persistence of the underlying tension into the post-human creation world of tablets 2 and 3, and the conflict between Enlil and Enki, between the principle of authority and order and the principle of intelligence and sympathetic intervention, is its deep structural expression. The question of where Enki's loyalties ultimately lie with the divine governance structure that made him one of the 3 primordial sovereign gods, or with the beings whose creation he designed and whose survival he consistently chooses to protect, the text does not decide. But the parallel between Enki's defiance of the divine authority structure and the Igigi's earlier collective revolt against it is visible in the narrative architecture. 2 forms of resistance to the same authority, one collective and one individual, one successful in its immediate aims, and one that takes the shape of a long, quiet, recurring protection of those who should not have survived. The fragment that contains Enki's warning to Atrahasis about the flood, the passage in which he speaks to a reed hut rather than directly to the man, maintaining the technical fiction of the divine oath's terms while violating its spirit entirely, is one of the most damaged sections in the surviving manuscripts. Precisely what Enki said, and how he justified it to himself, is among the passages the lacunae have swallowed. The tablets go quiet exactly where the text is most morally complex. The revolt narrative in Atrahasis did not exist alone in the Babylonian textual world. The tradition that humans were created to relieve divine labour, and that the gods experienced the world before human creation as an oppressive burden, appears across several independent Mesopotamian textual traditions, each of them arriving at the same underlying cosmological premise through different theological emphases. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, whose principal surviving manuscripts come from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, now held at the British Museum, presents a creation account that shares its architecture with Atrahasis, but differs from it in ways that reveal how the tradition was adapted as Babylonian theology evolved. In the Enuma Elish, the gods who must perform labour are those created by Tiamat, the primordial saltwater mother, to fight for her in the cosmic war against her consort's descendants. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and reshapes the cosmos from her body, the labour of maintaining the world falls to the gods of the losing side. They dig channels and carry earth, they complain. Marduk's response is to create humans from the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's champion, who is killed specifically for this purpose. The structural parallel with Atrahasis is clear. Divine beings perform labour. The labour becomes too much. Humans are created from divine blood mixed with clay to relieve them. But the emotional register of the 2 accounts is fundamentally different. In the Enuma Elish, the labour crisis is incidental, a consequence of a cosmic war that has already been settled, resolved as part of the clean administrative ordering of the newly created world. There is no night march, no burning of tools, no mob surrounding a frightened sovereign, no tearful assembly asking who is responsible for the revolt. The creation of humans in the Enuma Elish is an orderly act of divine governance, a sensible solution to a logistical problem. The Eridu Genesis, recorded on tablet CBS 10673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, is a Sumerian composition written in a different language from the Akkadian of the principal Atrahasis manuscripts, older by several centuries, coming from a world in which the theological vocabulary was still being worked out, rather than inherited. Jacobson's 1981 analysis of CBS 10673 in the Journal of Biblical Literature, the article that gave the text its modern name, identified it as the earliest surviving record of several traditions that appear in elaborated form in Atrahasis and later Babylonian compositions. The Eridu Genesis does not preserve a revolt narrative in the surviving sections, but Jacobson's analysis of its theological structure suggested that the traditions it draws on, including the idea that humans were created to provide the gods with the service they required, predated the Old Babylonian period by at least several centuries. Why does the Enuma Elish present the labour crisis as calm, where Atrahasis presents it as crisis? The divergence in emotional register between the two traditions has a partial answer in the political theology of each text composition context. The Enuma Elish was composed, in its surviving form, for Babylon, specifically as a theological defence of Marduk's supremacy among the Babylonian gods, adapted in the first millennium BCE to reflect Babylon's political dominance. A text written to celebrate the orderly cosmic triumph of the city's patron god would naturally present the creation of humans as a smooth administrative accomplishment rather than a revolutionary moment. The messiness of the revolt, the fear on Enlil's face, the collective declaration, these do not serve the Enuma Elish's ideological purpose. They are edited out. Atrahasis preserves an older layer of the tradition. The revolt's chaos, Enlil's fear, the specific procedural steps of the divine assembly, these belong to a version of the story that had not yet been rationalized for a particular political theology. Whether that older layer is more historically accurate in any meaningful sense, or simply preserves an earlier narrative convention, is not a question that can be resolved from the surviving evidence. What can be said is that the Atrahasis version is less tidy, less triumphalist, and more willing to present the divine governance of the cosmos as a structure under genuine, unresolved stress. What the comparison establishes, at minimum, is that the Atrahasis revolt narrative was not a unique or anomalous text. It was one formulation within a broader Babylonian theological conversation about the origins of divine labour, the creation of humanity, and the question of who bears the weight of maintaining the world. That conversation was conducted across several textual traditions, and the Atrahasis version was distinguished from the others not by the uniqueness of its cosmological premise, but by the specificity and dramatic weight it gave to the moment of collective resistance. 236 among several hundred objects acquired from Sipar in the same consignment. The acquisition was made under the supervision of E.A. Wallace Budge, then an assistant in the museum's Department of Oriental Antiquities during his third mission to Mesopotamia. Budge had been sent specifically to acquire cuneiform tablets on behalf of the museum, and he returned with a collection of considerable size. The circumstances under which Budge obtained the Sipar tablets have been discussed by subsequent scholars in terms that range from the diplomatically vague to the openly critical. The late Ottoman administration that nominally governed the region had formal regulations governing the export of antiquities, regulations that Budge's own published accounts of his missions suggest were not strictly observed during his acquisitions. Budge's later memoir, By Nile and Tigris, described his approach to antiquity procurement with a candour that later generations of museum professionals found uncomfortable. He maintained dealer networks, worked through intermediaries, and on at least some occasions moved objects out of the region in ways that subsequent archaeological ethics would not have sanctioned. Whether the Atrahasis tablets were among the objects acquired through irregular channels, or through the licensed market that also operated in the period, is not established in the surviving documentation. What is established is that they were in Sipar before Budge's mission, they were among the objects recovered from the ancient city site or its dealers, and that they entered the British Museum's collection in the spring of 1889. They were identified as Atrahasis fragments relatively quickly. The Epic of Atrahasis had been partially known to Western scholarship since the 1870s, when Assyriologist George Smith, working from other fragments already in the British Museum, had identified portions of the flood narrative. But the revolt sequence in Tablet 1, and the structure of the three-tablet narrative as a whole, could not be assembled from the fragments available before Budge's 1889 acquisition added the principal Sipar manuscripts to the collection. The tablets from Nippur arrived in their institution through a different route. The University of Pennsylvania expeditions to Nippur, funded partly by the university and partly by private subscription, excavated across multiple seasons between 1889 and 1900. Peters and Hilprecht, whose collaboration deteriorated into a public dispute that became something of a scandal in Assyriology at the turn of the 20th century, recovered tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets from the mounds of ancient Nippur, with estimates of the total yield across all expedition seasons ranging from 30,000 to considerably more, depending on how surface finds and dealer acquisitions are counted. The division of the material between Philadelphia and Istanbul followed negotiations with Ottoman authorities that allocated roughly half the recovered tablets to each institution. CBS 10673, the Eridu Genesis fragment, was in Philadelphia, and Jacobson had access to it for his 1939 work on the Sumerian king list, though his full analysis of the text did not appear until 1981. The Lambert and Millard edition of 1969 represents the moment at which the composite Atrahasis text, drawing on British Museum fragments, University of Pennsylvania fragments, and material from other collections, became available in a form that allowed the full scope of the revolt narrative to be read as a continuous sequence. Before 1969, scholars working on individual fragments had identified pieces of the revolt, but the complete four-column sequence of Tablet 1, from the opening description of divine labour through the tool burning, the night march, Nusku's interrogation, the unanimous declaration, Eliel's tears, Anu's council, Enki's proposal, and Mami's creation, this full sequence required the composite work that Lambert and Millard completed. Outside the community of Assyriologists, who received it as a landmark, the reception of the 1969 edition was considerably more modest. The flood story, Tablet 3 of the Atrahasis narrative, attracted the popular attention that any ancient precedent for the biblical deluge was guaranteed to attract. The academic press was quick to place the Babylonian flood account in conversation with Genesis, with the Epic of Gilgamesh, whose flood episode had been famous since George Smith's announcement at the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London in December 1872, and with the broader tradition of Near Eastern flood mythology. The revolt that preceded the flood, and which the text presents as the first cause of the sequence of events that eventually produces the flood, received considerably less popular attention. There is nothing conspiratorial about this asymmetry. A discovery that connects to an already established popular narrative will attract more attention than a discovery that requires its audience to develop a new framework for understanding what they are reading. The Atrahasis revolt did not fit neatly into any existing popular category. It was not a creation myth in the familiar sense. It was not a flood myth. It was something that required its audience to understand something about Mesopotamian cosmology, labour systems, divine hierarchy, and the specific shape of Babylonian political theology before its significance could be properly felt. Daly's 1989 translation in Myths from Mesopotamia made the revolt sequence available to a general audience with appropriate framing. The book was published by Oxford University Press and has remained in print, which means the revolt sequence has been available in a quality English translation for more than 3 decades. The revolt sequence was not hidden from history in the sense of being suppressed or concealed. It was hidden in the way that many important things are hidden, by the fragmentation of the physical record, by the slow pace of scholarly reconstruction, by the prioritization of attention toward the parts of a complex text that seemed most immediately legible, and by the accident of which Akkadian passages drew the sustained popular interest that the 20th century could have, but did not, direct toward the burning of the Igigi's tools. The Atrahasis revolt sequence ends, as far as the surviving text allows us to trace it, with the creation of humans and with Mami's declaration that the load has been transferred. What the text does not tell us, in any surviving passage, is what happened to the Igigi after that transfer was complete. They are present at the creation. They contribute their spittle to the clay. They celebrate. They kiss Mami's feet. And then, as the narrative shifts its attention to the new human population and the problems that population creates, the Igigi disappear from the text. The Weld Blundell prism at the Ashmolean Museum, recording the Sumerian king list from before the flood through the historical dynasties of the early 2nd millennium, makes no reference to the Igigi as an ongoing political force in the divine order. The Enuma Elish reduces them, in its cosmological scheme, to supporters of the defeated Tiamat who are eventually incorporated into the new divine administration. Later Akkadian texts use Igigi as a term for the heavenly gods generally, a semantic diffusion that makes it impossible to trace what happened to the specific divine workforce of the Atrahasis tradition. The silence may mean that the tradition understood the Igigi as having been dissolved into the larger divine collective once the labour crisis was resolved. It may mean that the question of their ongoing status was not theologically interesting to the Babylonian tradition once their function as a narrative catalyst had been served. It may mean that what the Atrahasis epic was preserving was not a continuous cosmological tradition about a specific class of divine beings, but a specific story, a compact, purposeful account of labour, resistance, and creation that did not require a sequel about the fate of its protagonists. What the text actually says, through the revolt sequence and the creation that resolves it, can be stated with some precision. It says that the world before humans existed required constant, hard, physical maintenance by divine beings who were not equipped with the same kind of authority over that maintenance that the great gods possessed. It says that the accumulated weight of that labour over an impossibly long cycle produced a collective grievance that no individual agent could be held responsible for and that no act of punishment could address. It says that the governing authority confronted with that grievance, even the supreme governing authority, the embodiment of cosmic order, experienced fear when it was made real, and that fear produced not a resolution of the underlying condition, but a transfer of the load to a newly created being who had not consented to receive it. And it says in the specific choice of the God killed to provide the substance of humanity, the God of hearing and understanding, that the beings created to absorb the load were given as part of their constitution the capacity to understand their situation. Whether the Babylonian tradition saw this as a gift or a burden, the text declines to say directly, but the parallel between Geshtwe's faculty of divine reception and Atrahasis's exceptional capacity to hear his God, and between that hearing and the survival that results from it, suggests that the understanding embedded in human nature was understood as the thing that allowed humans to navigate their relationship with the gods who created them, not to escape the load, but to bear it without being entirely consumed by it. The three interpretive frameworks that modern scholars have brought to the revolt sequence each illuminate something the others leave in shadow. The mythological symbolic reading captures the function of the text in Babylonian scribal culture. It answered a real question that real people in a labour-intensive agricultural civilization needed answered. Why do we work? Because the gods worked first and could not continue. Read through the lens of political philosophy, the revolt is a meditation on what happens to authority when the obedience it depends on is withdrawn, not by an individual who can be punished, but collectively, indivisibly, by every member of the workforce at once. The unanimous declaration preempts punishment. Enlil's fear confirms the structural severity of the crisis, and the solution transfers rather than reduces the burden. The underlying tension persists into the post-human creation world of tablets 2 and 3. The historical memorial reading, which treats the revolt as a preserved trace of an actual social memory about labour conflict, possibly from the very early periods of organised irrigation agriculture in Mesopotamia, is the most speculative and the most productive in its speculations. The Earth-3 administrative tablets that document labour drafts and their disruptions are not mythological documents. They record real systems of real coercion applied to real people. A society that organised its survival through compulsory irrigation labour and that experienced the consequences when that labour broke down had every reason to encode in its deepest theological narratives both the necessity and the danger of unresolved collective grievance. Each of these is a partial description of a text that resists exhaustion through any single interpretive framework. Lambert knew this. Daly knows this. The most honest description of what the Atrahasis revolt sequence is remains a story that is doing several things simultaneously with enough precision that each of the things it is doing can be identified and examined, and enough ambiguity that none of them can be declared the only thing it is doing. The tool burning in Atrahasis Tablet 1, the act that has threaded through this investigation since the opening planted it, turns out to be, on examination through each of the three interpretive frameworks, a different kind of event. In the mythological symbolic reading, the burning of tools is a cosmological marker, the moment at which the old world, the world of divine labour, is formally ended. The instruments of the old arrangement are destroyed before the new arrangement can begin. Fire, in the Mesopotamian ritual tradition, was the agent of transformation and purification, not merely of destruction. What burns is also what is transformed. The tools do not simply disappear, they are released from one function and freed for another, returned to the elemental fire god whose domain they enter. The burning precedes the creation, and in a theological tradition where the universe was understood as requiring constant acts of destruction and recreation to remain habitable, that sequencing is not incidental. In the philosophical ethical reading, the burning is the text's most precise formulation of what makes the revolt irreversible. The Igigi do not negotiate, they do not establish conditions for a return to work. They destroy the means of the work before making any demand, which means that the resolution cannot be a simple reinstatement of the previous arrangement. Whatever the great gods offer in response must be something genuinely new, because the old relationship is literally ash. Enlil cannot demand that the Igigi pick their tools back up, because the tools are gone. The burning forecloses the possibility of a provisional, easily retracted resolution, and forces the divine assembly to find something permanent, which is what they do, though permanent in this context means permanent for the gods' benefit, not the workers. In the historical memorial reading, the burning carries the weight of the very specific and very human tradition of destroying the instruments of an intolerable obligation. Across the ancient Near Eastern documentary record, the destruction of a contract tablet, the physical clay document that recorded a debt, an obligation, a labour agreement, was the formal act by which that contract was dissolved. Tools are not tablets, but the logic of destruction, as druidical dissolution, would have been familiar to any Babylonian who heard the revolt sequence. The Igigi are not making a gesture, they are performing, in the most literal terms available, the dissolution of their labour contract. Lambert's 1969 edition observed all three dimensions of the tool burning without organising them into a single interpretation, which is itself a methodological position. The text supports multiple readings because it was composed by people operating in multiple registers simultaneously, theological, ethical, social, and a reading that claims to have identified the single correct interpretation has probably reduced it to something smaller than it is. What the three readings share is their recognition that the burning is the first act of the revolt rather than an incidental detail. The text could easily have described the Igigi simply marching to Enlil's gate without specifying what happened to the tools. It does not do this. The burning is there, specific and vivid, and it precedes everything else. The narrative begins, in a sense, with fire. The surviving physical condition of the tablets that preserve this passage is worth noting in this context, without pressing the analogy too hard. 234 at the British Museum shows signs of the original firing that hardened it, the deliberate application of heat to make the clay permanent. The cuneiform signs pressed into that clay were preserved precisely because fire was applied to the object that bore them. The same force that the Igigi used to destroy their tools was used in a different context and with a different intention to preserve the record of their act. The tablets in the Atrahasis collection arrived at the British Museum in pieces. The lower right quarter of the principal Tablet 1 manuscript is missing, taking with it portions of columns 5 and 6 and leaving gaps in the revolt sequence that Lambert and Millard could only partially fill from other manuscript traditions. Those missing portions are gone in the way that ancient things go missing, through the accumulated damage of time, soil pressure, handling, the excavation and transport of objects whose value was not fully understood at every point in their journey from Sippar to London. The revolt sequence that survives is not complete. It is what remained after everything that could be lost was lost. The sections that survive are legible. That is itself something. The junior scribe Ipekaya completed his copy sometime in the reign of Amisaduqa, pressed the final line of the colophon into the third tablet, recorded the line count 1,245 lines for all 3 tablets together, and set the clay to dry. At some point after that, the tablets were fired. They entered a storage context somewhere in Sippar. Several thousand years passed. The oldest surviving traces of the traditions that the Atrahasis epic synthesizes and extends are visible in a small number of Sumerian compositions, texts in a different language from the Akkadian of the principal Atrahasis manuscripts, older by several centuries, coming from a world in which the theological vocabulary was still being worked out rather than inherited. CBS 10673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum is one of these. Jacobson's 1981 analysis of the text recovered a partial creation sequence in which the Anunnaki experience hunger and need before humans exist, a theological premise that underlies the Atrahasis Revolt without yet having the narrative machinery of collective action, burning tools, and divine assembly that the later Akkadian text develops. The Sumerian text is fragment rather than story. Its creation account survives in 260 lines, many of them damaged, and it arrives at its flood narrative without the revolt sequence that Atrahasis places before the flood as its cause. What this suggests is that the revolt narrative was not a primordial feature of the tradition, not present from the very earliest surviving records, but a development, an elaboration, a decision by the Babylonian tradition to give the origin of human labour not merely a functional explanation, humans exist to serve the gods, but a dramatic one. Humans exist because the beings who were doing the serving had reached the limit of what they could bear. The Sumerian antecedent establishes the premise. The Akkadian elaboration gives it its specific, vivid, politically charged form. The Weld Blundell prism at the Ashmolean Museum carries the Sumerian king list from before the flood, the long reigns of the pre-Diluvian kings, measured in Shah sickles, through the flood itself, which the prism records as a catastrophic break in the historical sequence, after which human kingship was restored with shorter reigns and the political order resumed in the cities that the gods had established. The king list is an administrative document dressed as a theological one. Its purpose was to legitimate contemporary political authority by connecting it to a continuous chain of divine sanction. It does not mention the Igigi. It does not mention the revolt. The flood in the king list is a break in kingship rather than a consequence of a crisis that began in divine labour conditions. The same event appears differently in different documents depending on what each document is trying to establish. The revolt narrative was preserved not through accident, but through institutional decision, through the choices made by successive generations of scribal administrators to include the Atrahasis epic in the curriculum that trained the writers, accountants, priests, and officials of Mesopotamian civilization for more than a millennium. Someone in every generation of that transmission decided that the story of the Igigi's revolt was worth knowing. The reasons they made that decision are not recorded. The decision itself is visible in the survival of the tablets. What those tablets do not preserve is any indication of what the Igigi felt about the resolution. The creation scene gives them a moment of collective relief, the kissing of Mami's feet, the new name bestowed on her, and then they recede from the narrative. The world goes on without them, or rather with them in some undescribed background role, the specific labour that defined their existence, now performed by the species created from the body of one of their own. The tablets are quiet on the Igigi's inner life from this point forward. Whatever they made of their relief, it did not make it into the colophon. 234 sits in its collection today, much as it sat in the museum when Lambert and Millard were assembling the composite text in the 1960s, the lower right quarter still absent, the surface still bearing the varying depths of Ibaya's impressions in the second column, the fired clay still intact in the way that fired clay from the 17th century BCE tends to be intact when the conditions of preservation have been adequate. Whatever has been assembled across these chapters about the revolt, the labour context that made it comprehensible, the hierarchy that gave it its constitutional weight, the night march and the tool burning and the unanimous declaration, the divine assembly's solution and the creation it produced, the scribe who copied it and the scholars who recovered it, all of that now rests against the physical reality of the object itself, which contains it all in a state of partial preservation. The lines about the tool burning are in there, the tamarisk comparison is in there. The phrase, "every single one of us gods declared war," is pressed into the clay of this tablet, in the cuneiform script of an old Babylonian junior scribe, in a passage that has survived more than 3,500 years in a form legibly enough to read. The lower right quarter is gone, and with it those lost lines. What they contained is not recoverable. Some portion of the revolt sequence, enough to be frustrating about, not enough to determine what the loss changes in the overall reading, exists now only as the absence of a clay section, a shape defined by where the damage stopped rather than where the text continued. If you are listening to this somewhere in the world tonight, in a city that Ipikiah would not have recognized, speaking a language that the Babylonian scribal tradition did not document, carrying in some inarticulate way the accumulated weight of every labour obligation that has been passed forward since the first channel was dug and the first worker lifted the first load, there is something in the Atrahasis revolt sequence that does not require translation. Not because it anticipates the specific forms that labour and grievance and collective action have taken in the centuries between Sippar and wherever you are, but because the text's central observation that an excessive load, borne over an impossibly long time, eventually produces a crisis that cannot be resolved by identifying and punishing the individuals responsible for it, is not a specifically Babylonian observation. The Igigi burned their tools in the middle watch of the night and marched to Enlil's gate in the 17th century before the Common Era, and the account of what they did was pressed into clay by a junior scribe who signed his work with a line count and a date. That account survived. The survival was not inevitable, it required a particular composition of clay, a specific decision to fire it, the relative dryness of a particular section of Mesopotamian soil, an acquisition mission in 1889, a century of institutional cataloguing, and 2 decades of Lambert and Millard's patient scholarly labour before what it contained became fully visible. But it survived. And what it describes, in the second column of a damaged tablet, in the Middle East collection of the British Museum, is a workforce that had been at the work for longer than any workforce should be asked to work, reaching the point where continuation was no longer possible, choosing a form of action that made negotiation impossible because the instruments of the old arrangement were ash, and forcing an authority that had never before been questioned to sit behind a locked gate and listen to a message it did not want to receive. Whether Enlil understood what he heard, whether the divine governance structure that produced the creation of humans as its solution understood that it had transferred a problem rather than resolved it, and that the transferred problem would come back in different forms through tablets 2 and 3 and beyond, is the question the text leaves with the reader. Not as a dramatic cliffhanger, as a genuinely open question about the nature of solutions that work by moving the weight rather than reducing it. The tablets are quiet on that point. Ipikiah completed his line count, recorded the name of the year, and set the clay down. The rest is what we bring to the silence. If this account has been useful to you tonight, wherever you are in the world, if you would like to continue these investigations into what the ancient records preserve and what they leave open, the channel is here whenever you return to it. But for now, the tablets have said what they have to say. The Tigris and Euphrates were dug, the tools burned, the load was transferred, the clay holds what it holds, the rest can wait until morning. Hand of Ipikiah, junior scribe, month AR. Year Amisaduqa was king.